The driver looked at Mara Ellis twice before he dropped the first load. The rain-damaged bales were stained, heavy, and sagging inside the twine. Nobody wanted them. Mara was paying to have them delivered. One more dry summer on her south quarter, and she could not afford another season of watching water run off the field. She did not need feed. She needed the ground to hold water. By 8 that morning, 2 trailers had emptied beside her south quarter. A hired hand cut the first set of strings, and the wet straw folded outward in dense yellow-brown slabs. The driver watched it fall. "You sure this is where you want it?" Mara pointed toward a row of orange flags running across the field. "Right there." 3 summers earlier, she would have thought the same load was useless. Back then, Mara was 47, and trying to keep 160 acres productive with less cash than the farm seemed to demand. The land had been in her family for years, but the bills were hers now. Her father had stepped away from daily work. Her brother had taken a construction job 2 counties over. And Mara had decided she would either make the farm function on its own numbers or stop pretending sentiment could carry it. The worst ground sat on a broad, exposed slope south of the machine shed. After a hard rain, water skimmed across the top and gathered in shallow ruts. After 2 hot weeks, that same surface hardened into a gray crust. A shovel would bite into the first inch and then stop with a dull knock. The problem was not that Mara had stopped fertilizing. She had not. The problem was that the field behaved less and less like soil. Seedlings emerged unevenly. Summer rain arrived fast and left faster. Bare ground heated until the air above it shimmered. Every season seemed to require more effort to protect a crop that had less margin for error. Mara noticed the first clue by accident. A plastic water line behind the packing shed split during early spring. By the time she shut the valve, a wide sheet of water had run across the yard. Most of it pooled in wheel tracks. But one strip near the shed swallowed the water almost as quickly as it arrived. That strip had been covered since autumn with loose wheat straw, left from packing bins and protecting tender plants from an early freeze. Mara pulled the straw aside. The ground beneath it was cool. It broke apart in small crumbs. A few inches away, the uncovered yard soil was slick on top and hard underneath. She stood there long enough for the difference to bother her. That night she started reading about crop residue, surface cover, decomposition, soil carbon, and the way living roots and organic matter affect structure. The more she read, the less interested she became in finding one miracle product. What caught her attention was simpler. Bare soil was taking every storm, every hot wind, and every tractor passed directly. The covered strip had been protected. Mara wanted to know whether that protection could be scaled beyond the yard. Her first attempt nearly convinced her it could not. She found a neighbor with leftover clean straw, borrowed a chopper, and worked a heavy amount directly into several acres before planting grain sorghum. She thought incorporation would speed everything up. The material would disappear into the soil, break down, and become the dark organic matter she wanted. Instead, the planter fought clumps. Emergence came up uneven. The young plants in the heaviest treated sections turned pale and lagged behind the rest of the field. Fresh, high-carbon residue was decomposing at the same time the crop was trying to establish. Mara had created a competition underground when she had meant to create help. She walked the rows one evening, with a spade in one hand and a notebook in the other, angry enough to blame the entire idea. Then she stopped. The mistake had not proved that plant residue was useless. It had proved that she had used it badly. She wrote 3 words across the top of a page. Keep it surface. The next season, Mara changed almost everything about the trial. She left coarse straw on top instead of burying it immediately. She used thinner, more even layers. Where material was already breaking down, she let it age before applying it. She kept residue away from tiny seedlings until they were established. She also stopped leaving every test strip bare between crops and began using living cover where the rotation allowed it. She marked treated and untreated lanes with stakes so she could compare them instead of trusting memory. Then she started measuring simple things. After a storm, she pushed bottomless metal cans into the ground and poured equal amounts of water into each ring. On the bare strip, water often lingered at the surface. On the covered strip, it disappeared sooner. On clear summer afternoons, she checked the soil under both surfaces. The mulched ground stayed cooler. When she dug, the covered soil began to break into softer aggregates instead of flat, hard plates. None of that happened in a week. Some areas still performed badly. Wind moved straw off the highest spots. Weed pressure changed in places. A few damp loads had to sit and partially decompose before she wanted them anywhere near a crop. Spreading material cost time and diesel even when the straw itself was cheap. But the direction of change was consistent enough for Mara to keep going. The second year brought the proof she cared about most. A violent summer thunderstorm crossed the farm after weeks of dry weather. Rain struck the south slope hard enough to turn the access road brown with runoff. Mara waited until the lightning moved east, pulled on boots, and walked the flagged strips. The bare lane was sealed at the surface. Water stood in shallow depressions and carried fine soil downhill. The covered lane looked messy. Straw had shifted. Mud showed in patches. But when Mara pushed a spade through the surface, the blade went in deeper with less force, and water was moving down instead of only across. She did not need a laboratory to understand that comparison. The storm had hit both strips. Only one had been protected from the first impact. She also noticed what the straw could not do. Where the crop was short on nutrients, surface cover did not correct the deficiency. Where tractor traffic had compacted the same track year after year, a thin layer on top did not erase the damage underneath. The residue could soften extremes and feed decomposition over time, but it could not replace fertility, rotation, or better traffic decisions. That changed the way Mara talked about the trial, even to herself. She stopped asking whether straw worked. The useful question was narrower. What problem was the straw solving here, and what problem was it not solving? That question saved her from repeating the first mistake on a larger scale. By the third season, Mara had expanded the method carefully, rather than blanket the entire farm. She used the cleanest rejected straw where erosion and heat were worst. She paired it with crop rotation and living roots where she could. She stopped treating the straw as fertilizer and started treating it as one part of a soil system. Then came the summer that tested whether any of it mattered under real pressure. Hot wind settled over the county in July. Day after day, the sky stayed hard and bright. Leaves rolled inward by noon. The top inch of the untreated ground dried quickly and split along old traffic lines. The covered strips did not stay lush. Mara never expected them to, but they lost moisture more slowly. The soil stayed cooler under the residue. Plants held their color longer. When a brief shower arrived, the covered surface accepted more of it before runoff began. There were still losses. One low section stayed too wet after an earlier storm and had to be managed differently. Another strip grew enough weeds to remind Mara that mulch could create new work while solving old problems. The farm was not suddenly drought-proof. It was simply less exposed. That distinction was worth money. When harvest was finished, the treated ground had not produced a miracle yield. What it had produced was consistency. Fewer thin patches, better stands across the slope, less visible erosion after storms, more days between the moment rain stopped and the moment the crop began showing severe moisture stress. For Mara, those margins mattered more than a dramatic number. A farm rarely survives because one season becomes spectacular. It survives because fewer ordinary problems become emergencies. The load of rejected straw arrived the following spring, because Mara had finally decided she could use more of it than neighboring farms wanted. The hauler had expected a disposal problem. Mara saw material that could cover ground she could not afford to leave naked. She did not take every bale offered. Anything contaminated, questionable, or too degraded for her plan stayed out. The wettest material was set aside to break down before use. The rest was spread only where it had a job to do. That was the part outsiders missed when they saw the trucks. Mara was not rescuing waste because waste was somehow virtuous. She was matching a discarded material to a specific weakness in her soil. Later that year, a farmer from the next road stopped at the fence after watching the south slope through 2 heavy rains. He did not ask whether straw was magic. He asked how Mara decided where to put it. She showed him the flagged lanes, the infiltration rings, the spots where wind had stripped the cover away, the section where she had used too much too early and created trouble. She showed him the weeds, too. The method looked less impressive after all the limitations were included. It also looked more believable. By autumn, Mara still had hard ground on the farm. She still had thin places. She still had to watch nitrogen, weeds, residue condition, labor, and weather. Restoring soil was not one decision. It was a sequence of smaller decisions that had to keep making sense under changing conditions. One evening after a slow rain, she walked to the first flagged strip with a shovel over her shoulder. The straw on top was darkened and flattened. New green growth pushed through in places. Water beaded briefly on a few stems, then dropped into the surface below. Mara set the shovel blade where the old crust used to stop her. She put one boot on the step. The blade slid down almost to the top of her boot before she had to lean on it. She left it standing there in the wet ground.